The grand ballroom of the Harrington Hotel glittered that night like something out of a dream, every chandelier dripping with crystals and every corner filled with whispered envy. Guests moved like jeweled chess pieces across velvet carpets, women in dresses that shimmered like moonlight, men in tuxedos perfectly tailored to their ambition. But in the center of it all stood Nicholas Harrington, the billionaire groom everyone wanted to witness, the man who turned heads not only because of his fortune but because of the icy confidence that clung to him like a second suit. Tonight, Nicholas was hosting an engagement celebration, his own. News of the engagement had stunned New York's socialites, because of who he chose. Not a supermodel. Not an heiress. Not an actress seeking spotlight. No, Nicholas had proposed to Evelyn Carter, a woman few knew by name, fewer still understood by heart. Evelyn entered the ballroom late, as if the night itself had bowed to her timing. She wasn't draped in diamonds or paraded like a prize. She wore a refined but modest sapphire dress, her hair sweeping gracefully over one shoulder in waves that caught the light only when she moved with purpose. She was beautiful, yes, but not in the engineered, calculated way Nicholas's world was accustomed to. Her grace carried honesty, her presence a mystery, her smile filled with a warmth that didn't belong amidst the glass and steel of high society. Whispers rippled like currents when she walked in. Why her? What does she have that others don't? Money can buy a model, an actress, even a princess, but this woman? Who is she to capture Harrington's fortune and heart? Nicholas, leaning with trademark detachment near the marble pillars, raised his glass when she appeared. For a man known for being untouchable, his gaze at Evelyn was something else entirely. He studied her not like one studies a contract but like an enigma, a puzzle he had decided to solve at any cost. She walked past the crowd with unflinching calm, joining him at the center. Fashionably late, Nicholas murmured, offering his hand. Only to see if you'd notice, Evelyn replied, slipping her hand into his as cameras flashed. His jaw tightened, a flash of competitiveness igniting in his eyes. She'd scored the first point in that subtle duel. That was Evelyn, always poised, always 2 steps ahead. The press captured staged smiles, photographs destined to circle magazines, captioned, "The most unlikely engagement of the year." Onlookers gossiped. She was lucky, she was calculated, she was about to drown in a life she couldn't handle. But if anyone thought Evelyn Carter was intimidated, they hadn't truly seen her yet. Neither had Nicholas. Because the truth was, this wasn't just marriage. This was a test, a wager of fates, a storm waiting on the horizon disguised as champagne bubbles and orchestral music. And while Nicholas was used to winning every game, he had no idea the real game had already begun. Hours dripped by in a haze of performances. Toasts rung out, laughter echoed hollowly, dancers twirled in gowns worth small fortunes. Nicholas and Evelyn played their parts convincingly enough. From the outside, it looked like a fairy tale beginning, the billionaire and his improbable bride-to-be. From within, though, Evelyn felt the weight of every gaze pressing on her back, each look questioning, each whisper cutting. Slipping from the ballroom toward the balcony, she sought air untainted by perfume and expectation. The city spread below, alive, glowing, unaware of the spectacle inside this hotel fortress. Evelyn leaned against stone and closed her eyes. Out here the world seemed honest, horns blaring, neon flashing, life bustling, uncontrolled. She didn't hear Nicholas approach, but suddenly he was there, his presence towering, the faint scent of expensive cologne drifting like smoke. "You tire of the circus already?" His tone was half mocking, half genuine. "I prefer places where people mean what they say," she answered. Nicholas smirked, tilting his head just slightly. "Then you'll find those places scarce in my world." "I'm well aware," she replied. And for a second, silence stretched between them, heavy yet thrilling, each sizing up the other, testing edges where love should be soft. He reached for her hand once more. "You entered this knowing who I am. Don't pretend you expected simplicity." "I didn't expect simplicity," Evelyn said calmly. "I expect respect. And maybe honesty, although I doubt you even remember how to spell it." His laughter was low, sharp. "You think you see through me?" "I don't think, Nicholas." "I know." Her words carved sharper than any jeweled knife. For the first time that evening, Nicholas's charm faltered, not visibly to anyone else but inwardly. He wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not by the woman who now stood between him and the empire of whispers. And yet, her refusal to fawn over him, her strength in staring right back into his storm, it intrigued him far more than worship ever had. Back inside, music swelled again. The crowd demanded their return. Evelyn turned and moved first, leading back inside as if declaring she was no ornament but a force of her own, a force Nicholas would have to reckon with. By the time the night ended, the engagement had been sealed visually with champagne, kisses for the cameras, staged perfection. But somewhere deep in Nicholas's chest, past the arrogance, past the practiced ambition, something uneasy stirred. Because Nicholas Harrington, billionaire of steel and glass, was used to bending the world. But Evelyn Carter? She didn't bend. And that terrified him. What nobody in that ballroom realized as flowers wilted and servants cleared glasses into silver trays, was that this marriage would unravel far beyond society gossip. This union, sparked by wealth, fueled by pride, would uncover truths that neither Nicholas nor Evelyn imagined. It wasn't a love story built on roses. It was a wager of souls, with secrets sharp enough to cut the richest man to his core. And Evelyn, who the world dismissed as plain, hid truths far more dangerous than Nicholas had ever faced in boardrooms or hostile takeovers. The story had only just opened. The weeks that followed the engagement blurred into a parade of events measured not in days but in appearances. Magazines plastered Nicholas and Evelyn on covers, analysts speculated how this union would affect Harrington Holdings, and gossip channels dissected Evelyn's every outfit as if fabric alone could explain how she'd captured the attention of New York's most elusive billionaire. Evelyn's life had transformed overnight. Chauffeur-driven cars, stylists knocking at her door, invitations to galas where she was expected to smile among strangers who looked at her more like an acquisition than a bride-to-be. But through it all, her composure never cracked. She endured the spotlight the way one endures a storm, shoulders squared, steps measured, eyes forward. Nicholas watched her with both fascination and suspicion. Each time she refused to be dazzled by diamonds or fame, it poked at his pride. For a man who had always conquered with wealth, Evelyn was a paradox. She wore simplicity as though it were armor. While other women begged for his attention, Evelyn often seemed like she desperately wanted freedom from it. Yet she stayed. That, more than anything, confounded him. Their wedding, of course, had to be an extravagant performance. Nicholas's assistant curated every detail. A cathedral draped in white roses, a guest list pulsing with social royalty, news helicopters circling the skyline. To anyone watching, it was a love story sealed beneath stained glass and organ music. But Nicholas knew better. He caught the barely there hesitation in Evelyn's eyes as she walked down the aisle, the faint pause in her breathing before speaking the vows. And Evelyn? She felt the weight of the moment like chains dressing her shoulders. She wasn't marrying for diamonds despite what the tabloids said. She was marrying for reasons Nicholas couldn't yet begin to understand, reasons tightly folded and hidden deep within her silence. When the ceremony concluded, Nicholas leaned close during their first dance, his lips brushing the top of her ear. "You play your part convincingly," he whispered. Her eyes remained on the watching crowd. "So do you." The dance ended, applause thundered, and from that moment public life declared them husband and wife, a union blessed with vast wealth and endless possibilities. But behind the closed doors of the Harrington penthouse, reality bloomed differently. Nicholas's penthouse was every magazine cliché, glass walls slicing through skyline, marble floors gleaming like mirrors, art pieces abstract enough to intimidate. For years, it had been his fortress, his throne, the one place where every inch was shaped by wealth. Evelyn stepped into it on their wedding night, silent as she took it in. "Welcome home," Nicholas said grandly, spreading his arms with the pride of an emperor introducing his empire. She walked slowly across the room, her hand brushing the edge of a modern sculpture worth more than entire houses. "It feels empty." He froze, then laughed. "Empty? With all this?" "With all this," she repeated. Her gaze drifted to the window and the sea of glowing city lights. "These walls hold things. But they don't hold warmth." For the first time, Nicholas felt something jag against his ego. 5 years earlier, a comment like that would have earned dismissal. He thrived on control, on admiration, on breaking down anyone who challenged him. But Evelyn's voice was not mocking, it was fact. Her truth struck because it didn't ask his permission. They settled into married life, on paper. In practice, it was a war of wills disguised as civility. Nicholas tested her with extravagant surprises, a velvet box on her dresser containing a necklace that shimmered like captured stars. Evelyn looked at it, smiled politely, and closed the lid without a word. He arranged last-minute trips to Paris, Venice, Dubai. Evelyn often declined, preferring the bookstore near their block, or quiet tea at a corner cafe. "What woman refuses Paris?" he asked one evening, genuine disbelief curling into arrogance. "What woman accepts it just to prove something?" Evelyn countered. He stared at her as if seeing a riddle carved into living form. To Nicholas, saying no to him was almost unnatural. And yet Evelyn had a way of saying no that felt stronger than all the yes he'd ever commanded. Still, even Evelyn found herself wrestling inside. The penthouse was indeed cold, but Nicholas, beneath his walls of confidence, was colder yet. And though she despised the arrogance, she couldn't deny his force. He was a storm, people bent or drowned under him. Yet she had entered this marriage with her eyes open, knowing full well what shadow she was stepping into. She had not come to be broken but to stand. Late one night, during their third week of marriage, Nicholas returned from a business meeting, his tie loosened, his face set in restless frustration. Evelyn sat in the living room with a book, not startled by his presence. "Another failed negotiation?" she asked without looking up. "Not failed. Stalled. They'll come around." His voice carried sharp certainty, but his frown betrayed just a sliver of doubt. Evelyn closed her book and finally looked at him. "You're so certain everyone bends eventually. Do you always believe it?" "Always," Nicholas replied smoothly. "Then consider me the exception." For the first time, Nicholas felt silence sting him. He hated that it thrilled him almost as much as it unsettled him. Evelyn wasn't resisting to play games, not like socialites who teased for attention. She resisted because it was who she was. And that steadiness was foreign, almost dangerous. They clashed often, at breakfast tables, at charity galas, in the car while cameras waited outside. Nicholas asserted his dominance through decisions big and small: what restaurant they'd dine at, what schedule they'd keep. Evelyn, however, learned the art of controlled resistance. Sometimes she let him have his way with ironical grace. Other times, her refusal was so measured that he realized too late she had outmaneuvered him entirely. Still, Nicholas wasn't a man to merely spar. He grew curious. He began watching Evelyn differently, her small habits, her silences, the way her eyes lingered longer on real moments of kindness from strangers than on polished decadence. She was layered. Unreadable to outsiders, unreadable even to him. And Nicholas Harrington was not a man who tolerated mysteries. But Evelyn carried hers like a sword wrapped in silk, always near, always dangerous, waiting for its moment. The city saw Nicholas and Evelyn as a spectacle, a power couple embodying billionaire fantasy. Behind the scenes, though, tension simmered. Their days were polished for the world, their nights filled with watching each other too carefully. It was almost exhilarating, like living inside a chess game where each move invited an unseen consequence. One evening, standing alone on the balcony, Nicholas admitted something out loud that startled even himself. "She might undo me." The city below didn't answer, but inside himself he knew. Evelyn Carter did not belong to his world, yet she'd entered it, and the balance of power was no longer his to command entirely. The storm was coming. Tension has a strange way of weaving itself into silence. It lingers in the pauses, in the glances, in the words left unsaid. By the fourth week of Nicholas and Evelyn's marriage, the penthouse had become a palace of silences. Some were heavy, some sterile, and others dangerous. Nicholas Harrington was a man accustomed to predictable outcomes. Money equaled loyalty, power equaled obedience, charm equaled conquest. Yet Evelyn remained an unsolved puzzle. Each morning she conducted routine life with grace but never with the fragile awe he expected. When he surprised her with rare wines, she poured them down the sink, saying tea suited her better. When he moved meetings around to schedule luxury trips, she insisted she had her own commitments. Those commitments being reading, volunteering, or simply walking freely around the city like she wasn't tethered to billions. At first, Nicholas tried to laugh it off. "You're not like the others," he'd smirk, brushing off her refusal as novelty. But by the end of that first month, novelty had shifted into agitation. For a man who thrived on control, Evelyn's quiet resistance was like an itch he couldn't scratch. One evening, during a dinner meticulously prepared by private chefs, Nicholas noticed Evelyn eating with careful calm while ignoring the array of rich delicacies around her. "Do you realize," Nicholas said, setting down his fork with just enough force to catch her attention, "that people would kill for this meal? And yet I'm not one of them," Evelyn replied plainly, slicing into her salmon. Her tone was calm, deadly calm. Nicholas stared at her. For most people, that stare carried the weight of intimidation. It was sharp, practiced, the look of a man who had broken rivals in boardrooms and cowed competitors into silence. Evelyn didn't even flinch. She met his gaze steadily until he was the one who finally broke eye contact. Her refusal to play by his rules began to gnaw at him. Why had she really agreed to marry him? If not for luxury, if not for status, then what drove her? Nicholas despised uncertainty, and yet here it was, sitting across the table, staring him in the eye every single night. The breaking point came unexpectedly on a Saturday. Nicholas had returned home from a tense meeting regarding a billion-dollar merger, his nerves on fire. He expected Evelyn to greet him with soft words, perhaps supportive silence. Instead, he found her in the sunroom reading a modestly bound novel, utterly unconcerned with his frustrations. "Do you have any idea what I'm handling out there?" he asked suddenly, his voice sharp, more accusation than curiosity. Evelyn glanced up, unshaken. "Do you think the weight of your empire gives you license to demand sympathy?" "It's not sympathy. It's respect." "No, Nicholas. Respect is not demanded, it's earned. And you mistake fear for respect daily." The words landed like a blade across his ego. Nicholas's fists clenched at his sides, the room suddenly too small for his presence. No competitor, no investor, no board member had ever dared slice into his pride so cleanly. But Evelyn? She did it without raising her voice, without theatrics, only with truth. For a long moment Nicholas said nothing. Then he barked out a laugh, hollow and sharp. "You think you know me? But you'll learn, Evelyn. People break. They all do." Evelyn closed her book with deliberate patience, stood and walked past him toward the balcony. She didn't need to repeat the words she'd said weeks earlier, "Consider me the exception." Yet somehow in her silence the sentence echoed again. That night Nicholas lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He hated the way her defiance burned inside him. He hated the unfamiliar flicker of uncertainty that came when she met his stare fearlessly. But most of all, he hated that beneath the irritation he felt something dangerously close to admiration. The following week things escalated. Nicholas began exerting control more forcefully, canceling her plans without telling her, assigning drivers to limit her movements, scheduling her life as if she were another property to manage. Evelyn adapted with remarkable resilience. Each move he made, she countered with something subtle yet potent. Pointed questions at charity dinners, dismissive smiles when he flaunted wealth, calm words that stripped arrogance from his chest like bark stripped from a tree. Onlookers of course saw none of this. To the city they were still the enviable couple. Magazines featured spreads of their honeymoon glow, tabloids praised Evelyn's understated fashion sense. Behind the cameras, every photo op was a battlefield where wills clashed beneath perfectly aligned smiles. Until one night, Evelyn shattered the fragile game completely. It was late, the penthouse aglow with city lights beyond glass. Nicholas poured himself a drink, loosening his tie after another long day. Evelyn, however, stood at the far side of the room, her back to him. "I know why you married me," she said suddenly, her voice steady, slicing the silence in half. Nicholas glanced up sharply. "Do you?" Her shoulders straightened, though she didn't face him yet. "It wasn't love. It wasn't destiny. It was because to you I looked like a challenge. Not your type, not your world, but something you thought you could conquer anyway. It was never about me. It was about you, proving yourself." Nicholas's lips parted, irritation sparking, but Evelyn finally turned. Her eyes burned with something he couldn't quite identify but knew was dangerous. "And if that's true," she continued, "then you need to understand, this relationship isn't your victory lap. It's your reckoning." Reckoning. The word cut. Reckoning was not in Nicholas Harrington's vocabulary. He was victory, dominance, success, but reckoning? That belonged to ruined men, men without control. And suddenly he realized, Evelyn hadn't entered this marriage as a prize in his palm. She had entered with her own reasons, her own agenda shadowed behind her calm facade. That night, when Nicholas lay awake again, it wasn't arrogance filling his chest. It was unease. For the first time, he felt the faintest suggestion that he might have miscalculated. That Evelyn was more than a mysterious bride. That she hid something beneath her composure, something powerful enough to crack even his empire's walls. And that thought alone kept him from sleep far longer than numbers or mergers ever had. The storm wasn't just coming. It had already begun. The Harrington penthouse had always radiated victory, every sleek wall and dazzling chandelier a monument to Nicholas's conquests. But now the room seemed to echo with something else entirely: unease. It wasn't the markets, it wasn't the board, it wasn't scandal in the press. No, the uncertainty came from Evelyn, who, despite her soft smile and polished public appearances, carried within her a truth that Nicholas could feel pulsing like a heartbeat he couldn't place. He began noticing the smallest details. Evelyn always seemed composed, but at times her eyes lingered in ways that unsettled him. When he spoke of his ruthless climb in business, she listened too carefully, as if she were memorizing each admission. When guests praised his empire, Evelyn sometimes looked away, her expression unreadable. She was present in his world but never absorbed by it. Instead, she appeared to be watching, measuring, calculating. The realization gnawed at him: Nicholas Harrington was being studied. And he hated it. By the second month of marriage, Nicholas realized he no longer thought about Evelyn as just the exception. She was becoming an obsession. At night he tossed between silk sheets, conducting silent interrogations in his mind. Why did she truly accept? What was she hiding? Why does she not bend? He had mastered markets worth billions but could not decipher the quiet woman who now ate breakfast across from him. One Tuesday morning was particularly tense. Nicholas reviewed financial reports at the long glass dining table, Evelyn quietly sipping her tea opposite him. The silence was typical but felt like another duel. Finally he lifted his eyes, impatience cutting his voice. "You've won, you know," he said unexpectedly. Evelyn placed her cup down with deliberate calm. "Won what?" "You resist, and here I am, thinking of nothing else but how to understand it. You've turned me into the competitor desperate for ground. That's new for me." Her lips curved faintly, not cruelly but knowingly. "Maybe winning isn't about bending others, Nicholas. Maybe it's about seeing yourself clearly for the first time." The words stung because they dangled too close to the truth. He had begun looking at himself differently in her presence. Each time she brushed aside his wealth, it forced him to stare at the emptiness he'd buried under gold and glass. For the first time, wealth felt flimsy, like a shield cracking. But his pride wasn't gone, it reared with venom. Nicholas was determined to tilt the balance back. He tightened control quietly, canceling Evelyn's charity involvements, blocking her calls, surrounding her movements with suffocating security. "For your safety," he told her, though they both knew better. For him, it was about power, about reminding her he was still the one setting terms. Evelyn, however, refused to break. Her independence grew sharper. She moved through their penthouse as if she were not a guest in Nicholas's empire but its quiet master, ignoring his gifts, rejecting his attempts at bribery, speaking truths in calm tones that left deeper wounds than insults ever could. One night, after days of growing frost, she confronted him in the library where he pored over reports. "This marriage," she said, her voice steady but laced with something deeper, "was never about the money for me." Nicholas leaned back in his chair, half-smirk tugging his lips. "Enlighten me then. What was it about?" Her pause was deliberate, her eyes unwavering. "Not yet." He hated her answer even more than rejection. "Not yet" implied that there was something more, something enormous, waiting beyond the horizon. A secret. And that secret haunted him. The days turned into weeks. Nicholas's obsession sharpened until it bled into his work. Meetings distracted him, documents blurred in front of his eyes, partners questioned his temper. His empire, built on order and precision, now trembled under the weight of a single woman's silence. By the third month, Nicholas caved to the one tactic he never imagined he'd use: surveillance. Discreet, of course. He instructed private investigators to track Evelyn's past, her education, her family, her every movement before entering the Harrington orbit. He expected to find relationships hidden, debts paid off, or perhaps even ambitious ties explaining her motives. But what he discovered only deepened the mystery. Evelyn Carter's life, at least on paper, was disarmingly simple. Raised by a father who'd run a modest business, educated with average means, no long papers trails of extravagance. There was no glaring clue why she'd accept the marriage. Yet Nicholas's investigator mentioned one strange detail in passing. Her father's company had declared bankruptcy years ago, around the same time Nicholas's corporate acquisitions had ruthlessly expanded. Nicholas dismissed it at first. He had consumed dozens of small companies during his rise. It couldn't mean anything specific. And yet, when he brought it up casually at dinner one evening, Evelyn's hand trembled slightly around her glass, barely perceptible but real. "You never told me much about your father's business," Nicholas said lightly, watching her. Evelyn slowly set her glass down, her calm mask freezing briefly before smoothing again. "Most things don't warrant remembering, Nicholas." But her eyes gave her away, if only for a flicker. Anger. Pain. Resentment. Nicholas's mind flooded with possibilities. Had he destroyed her father's company? Was Evelyn here not as a wife but as a weapon cloaked in silk and patience? For the first time, fear coiled in his gut. Not fear of embarrassment. Fear of her. That night he sat alone in the penthouse study, staring at the city, glass of whiskey untouched. His empire stretched across the skyline like a kingdom of his own making. Yet he couldn't quiet the whisper creeping at the back of his mind. What if Evelyn came here not for wealth, but to dismantle me from inside? The thought gnawed deeper with every hour that passed. The next morning, Evelyn reappeared at breakfast as if nothing had changed. She poured tea, buttered bread, smiled faintly when she caught Nicholas's frown. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but he didn't. Because beneath the suspicion, beneath the unease, was something fragile, something dangerous. He didn't just fear Evelyn's motives. He was beginning to fear losing her entirely. And Nicholas Harrington, who never feared anything, suddenly realized his wife might hold both the dagger and the key to his soul. The storm wasn't in the distance anymore. It had seeped into their very walls, wrapped around their every interaction. And Evelyn? She knew exactly what she was doing. The rain had been falling for hours against the glass walls of the penthouse, painting streaks of silver down the endless panels that framed the city. Nicholas stood there as though the storm demanded his attention, scotch swirling in one hand, silence heavy on his shoulders. He thought about mergers, losses, new expansions overseas, but all those powerful gears of his empire seemed small compared to the riddle within his home. Behind him, Evelyn moved quietly, almost ghost-like. She had learned to glide through this penthouse without effort, her presence both soft and startling. Tonight, however, there was intent in her steps. She settled into a chair across the room and spoke after a deliberate pause. "You're restless," she said simply. Nicholas turned, defensive by instinct. "Restless? Distracted, maybe. I carry the weight of billions on my back." Her gaze was calm, unaffected. "Don't mistake money for weight. Weight is what you carry when you can't escape your own actions." Her words whipped through him. He wasn't sure how much she knew, or if she was dancing circles around suspicions he hadn't voiced. He narrowed his eyes. "And what exactly are you implying?" Evelyn leaned back, folding her hands. "Nothing you're ready to face out loud yet." Her composure set his teeth on edge. This was not a woman intimidated by power, and every time she spoke like that, Nicholas felt himself teetering on a cliff he'd never stood near before. He was used to control, to keeping people unsettled. Evelyn reversed the game with surgical precision, and it both unnerved him and ignited a dangerous curiosity. Later that night, Nicholas caught himself studying her while she read. She wasn't flashy or dramatic like women from his past. She read with full concentration, as though books were portals more vivid than all the wealth he'd laid at her feet. For a fleeting moment he wondered, why had she chosen to come into his world? Surely she could have avoided him. Unless, of course, stepping into his empire had been her plan all along. Days passed with tension rising, small fractures widening like cracks along old marble. Nicholas pressed, probing more each night, and Evelyn sidestepped with grace. Sometimes it was a sharp retort, other times a deflecting smile. Either way, every conversation ended with Nicholas wanting answers he didn't have. Finally, on an evening filled with thunder, Evelyn broke the silence deliberately. She waited until they were seated opposite each other in the cavernous living room, the sound of rain filling the pauses. Then she set down her cup of tea with a click that echoed louder than thunder itself. "I think," she said with softness almost cruel, "we need to stop pretending this marriage is about appearances." Nicholas's brows narrowed. "Isn't it? To the world? To the photos? To the people analyzing every move we make?" Her lips pressed into the faintest smile. "To the world, yes. But for us? It's about a truth you haven't admitted yet." He stood, unable to sit in stillness. "If you think I'll play guessing games?" Evelyn cut him short with one even look. "What does the name Carter mean to you?" Nicholas's chest tightened. He knew the name, of course. The investigator had unearthed her family's failed company. But to hear her cast it into the room like a controlled weapon, it was different. "Your family business," he said flatly. "My father's company," Evelyn corrected, her voice sharp but calm. "A small firm playing by honest rules in a world of predators. Until you came along. Until you swallowed it, strangled it, and left ruins where he had built his life." Nicholas's mind reeled backward. Numbers, deals, signatures, boardrooms filled with cold satisfaction. Faces blurred. He had taken dozens, maybe hundreds, of companies over the years. One man's downfall had been another day's victory on the stock ticker. But Evelyn's eyes now cut through layers of memory, crystallizing one truth he couldn't laugh off. He had destroyed her world before she ever entered his. Nicholas struggled for words and failed. Evelyn's expression didn't soften. "You want to know why I married you?" she asked, every syllable deliberate. "It wasn't because of your charm, and it certainly wasn't for your wealth. It was because I wanted to look you in the eye every day and remind you of what you've done. This is not your game, Nicholas. This is mine." For one unreal moment, Nicholas felt something he hadn't felt in decades: fear. It wasn't fear of ruin because he could rebuild empires. It wasn't fear of public shame because he could buy silence. It was something rawer. Evelyn had stripped him of something even more essential: the illusion that he was untouchable. Yet she didn't raise her voice, didn't gloat, didn't pound the victory home. She simply leaned back quietly, as though she had handed him a truth and was content to let it unspool inside his chest. Nicholas turned away, walking toward the windows as though the skyline could shield him. His heart pounded too fast, his grip too tight on the glass he hadn't realized he was still holding. "You think this is revenge?" His voice broke slightly. "That living here married to me gives you back what you lost?" "This isn't about getting anything back," Evelyn replied, her calm more chilling than rage could have been. "It's about making you understand what it feels like to stand on the other side of your conquests. To be the casualty. And it's about watching whether a man like you can ever carry the weight of that truth." Her words left no room for rebuttal. Nicholas stared out into the storm, his reflection fragmented in the glass. He had everything, yet in that moment all he could feel was the gaping void inside, the hollow emptiness Evelyn had placed her finger on from their very first night. Hours later, long after Evelyn had quietly gone to bed, Nicholas remained in that exact position. He hadn't known until now how terrible silence could be when it was filled not with emptiness, but with truths meant to unravel a man. And for the first time in his gilded life, Nicholas Harrington understood he was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. Morning felt different in the Harrington penthouse after Evelyn's revelation. The very walls seemed colder, the clinking of china at breakfast louder, the air thick with an invisible storm. Nicholas sat with his usual financial briefings in front of him, but the words blurred into nothing. For the first time in years he struggled to focus. Across the table, Evelyn ate her meal with clinical precision, her calm as unshaken as if she'd admitted nothing the night before. She buttered toast, sipped tea, and occasionally glanced up as though she were the teacher, and Nicholas the student who hadn't done his homework. Finally he snapped. "You think you can break me with talk of the past? A small company, Evelyn, one among scores. That's business." She lowered her cup slowly, quietly. Then she looked him squarely in the eye. "You don't even remember my father's name, do you?" The words sliced deeper than Nicholas wanted to admit. He searched his mind desperately, but her question revealed its answer before he spoke. Lines of numbers, deals, contracts. Yes. Names, lives, the fragile threads behind those numbers. No. His silence was all the confession Evelyn needed. She smiled, but it wasn't warmth. It was triumph mixed with grief. "That's why I'm here. To make sure you can't erase what you've destroyed, even by forgetting." Nicholas's hand tightened around his silverware until the strain showed in his knuckles. You mean to remind me every moment for 6 months? What? That you blame me for the choices your father made? People rise and fall in my world, Evelyn. He wasn't strong enough. Her eyes glinted with restrained fury, but her voice remained calm. You still think power makes you untouchable. But it's not strength to crush what's smaller than you. It's cowardice. For the second time in 24 hours, silence felled Nicholas with the weight of truth. He wanted to argue, to roar, to throw his empire back at her like a shield. Yet something sank inside him. Maybe because Evelyn's composure meant she wasn't trying to win an argument. She had already won. That day, Nicholas entered his offices with a fury that felt foreign, lashing out at subordinates, snapping during presentations. His board members, long familiar with his dominance, shifted nervously. There were cracks appearing in Harrington control for the first time in memory. By late evening, Nicholas dismissed an entire team from his office, slamming the door and realizing with disgust that the echo reminded him of Evelyn's words, cowardice. When he returned to the penthouse, Evelyn was again in the library, a lamp glowing while shadows clung to the edges of the room. She read with the stillness of someone undisturbed, and Nicholas felt rage at that composure. He wanted to shake her, to shatter the mask, but instead he collapsed into a chair opposite her. You believe you've condemned me, he muttered hoarsely. But what happens when this so-called revenge ends? The bet's done, the months are up, and you've delivered your speech. What then? Evelyn closed the book with precision, setting it aside like a weapon she could return to later. Then you live with yourself. And for a man like you, that will be worse than any sentence I could craft. Nicholas swallowed hard, his throat dry with words unsummoned. She was right, her greatest weapon wasn't leaving. It was staying, forcing him to see himself each night in the mirror, stripped of illusions. The next weeks tore at him in ways Nicholas hadn't expected. He found himself thinking less about acquisitions and more about Evelyn's steady gaze. Her presence infected his decisions. During board debates, he caught himself remembering her saying, "Money doesn't buy dignity." During deals, the memory of her expression when he failed to recall her father's name struck like iron. He tried, in halting gestures, to push back against the tide of guilt. One evening he arranged a dinner at a 5-star restaurant with the same unspoken message he always carried. Let me impress you, let me overwhelm you. Evelyn, dressed elegantly but not extravagantly, sat quietly across from him, and gave him nothing more than polite conversation. Every dazzling course, every over-the-top server announcement, fell hollow against her calm refusal to play along. When dessert arrived, crafted sugar art worth more than most cars, Evelyn spoke gently. I told you before, Nicholas, I'm not interested in your wealth. And until you learn to exist without waving it like a sword, you'll never be interesting to me either. The quiet sting of those words haunted Nicholas for days. He began noticing things he'd once ignored. Staff members lowering their heads when he barked at them, assistants retreating into silence, old friends who laughed but never trusted, rivals who shook his hand but hated him nonetheless. For the first time he began to wonder, had Evelyn been right all along? Was his empire only fear dressed in success? One night, reaching desperation, Nicholas confronted her differently. Not with arrogance, not with power, but with something dangerous for him, vulnerability. What do you want from me, Evelyn? He asked in a rare, hoarse whisper, his voice stripped bare. You've cut me open wide enough. What would it take for the truth? For this game to end? Evelyn studied him quietly, weighing the sincerity trembling in his tone. For a moment Nicholas thought she might soften. But then she shook her head slightly. You still don't understand. This isn't about ending a game. This is about you learning there was never a game to begin with. Only consequences. Nicholas stayed awake that entire night, pacing the marble floors like a caged beast with demons circling his mind. He replayed his ruthless ascents, signatures on contracts that destroyed livelihoods, his image in glossy magazines, the hollow victories he mistook for legacy. Evelyn's words had lodged themselves deeper than knives. For the first time in his life, Nicholas Harrington didn't care about tomorrow's numbers. He didn't care about polished appearances. All he could think of was Evelyn, and the question he now dreaded, was he finally seeing himself for the first time? The billionaire who thought he owned the world was unraveling. And Evelyn, across the hall, was quietly watching his empire of pride collapse, not with glee, but with the certainty of someone who had been waiting years for this moment. The 5th month of their marriage carried a different rhythm. Nicholas had never before lived his life aware of someone's gaze, yet Evelyn's presence, steady and exacting, seemed to haunt every decision he made. He couldn't enter his boardroom without remembering how her calm voice whispered cowardice. He couldn't sign new contracts without wondering who, behind the ink, might be staring at him with eyes as cold as hers had been when she told him he had destroyed her father. The mighty Nicholas Harrington began to falter. The market noticed first. Subtle at first, hesitation in quarterly presentations, sharp edges blunted in negotiation calls. His team grew restless. Investors started bristling. And Nicholas, who had once devoured competitors without blinking, found himself weighed down, distracted. During dinners he was prone to sudden silences. During evenings he paced, restless. Evelyn said little but saw everything. She played her part like a conductor, adjusting tempo with the smallest of gestures. Sometimes it was silence, sometimes a calm but piercing question. Sometimes it was nothing more than a dismissive smile when he bragged about his glory days. Each interaction chipped at the facade Nicholas had hidden behind for years. It was during a dinner at the penthouse that she chose her next strike. The table between them was set as always, silver, glassware gleaming, food immaculate. Nicholas, restless as ever, gestured vaguely at the wine. The vineyard in Bordeaux sent us 8 bottles. You won't find this vintage anywhere else in the country. Evelyn didn't look up. Do you think wine impresses a woman who's buried her father because of what you call business? The fork clattered out of Nicholas's hand. The air in the room thickened, silence holding dominion over everything. For the first time in years his appetite simply vanished. Enough, Nicholas murmured finally, voice strangled by emotion. What do you want me to do? Tell me how to make it right. Evelyn's gaze was unwavering. You can't bring him back. You can't erase what you've done. The question isn't what you can do for me. The question is what, if anything, you'll do for yourself. The words coiled inside Nicholas long after dinner. He paced the living room at midnight, shadows bending across glass walls. Evelyn had thrown a challenge he couldn't buy his way out of. For the first time, the billionaire who once owned New York's skyline asked himself a question that terrified him. What would redemption even look like? And yet beneath the fear stirred another, darker panic. The panic of losing her entirely. Nicholas discovered, much to his unease, that he didn't merely want Evelyn to stop accusing him. He wanted her respect. No, worse, he wanted her. Not as property, not as a trophy, but as a woman whose love would mean something far greater than the applause of strangers in black-tie ballrooms. But love was dangerous for a man like Nicholas. Why? Because it couldn't be conquered. He had no blueprint for it. And Evelyn seemed determined to teach him that very lesson through pain. The weeks crawled onward. Evelyn continued her small trials. She exposed his patterns mercilessly. When he commanded, she disobeyed with grace. When he withheld, she carried on unbothered. When he tried to isolate her, she carried herself as if the cage were a world of her choosing. Nicholas slowly began to see his empire through her eyes, flooded with glass and money but empty, sterile, lonely. Isolation disguised as grandeur. One evening, after a particularly brutal board confrontation where Nicholas's temper had left allies shaken and rivals mocking, he returned home uncharacteristically beaten. Evelyn was in the balcony garden, the small terrace she nurtured with plants the staff could never understand why she cared for. You've been quiet these days, he muttered, as though it were an accusation. Evelyn's fingers lingered on a leaf as she answered. Because silence often says more than words. Nicholas sighed heavily, collapsing into the chair across from her. You've broken me, Evelyn. No, she said, turning to him with eyes like sharpened glass. I've shown you what's already broken. The word stripped him bare. He pressed his palms to his face, a billionaire reduced to confusion. He had always thought wealth armored him from the vulnerability of men. But beside Evelyn, wealth felt not like armor but like rust. Heavy. Crumbling. Poisonous. It was in that raw moment that something cracked. Something Evelyn noticed in the way Nicholas looked at her, stripped of arrogance, eyes carrying a plea. He wanted more than victory now. He wanted forgiveness. But forgiveness wasn't hers to grant so easily. Evelyn straightened, her voice measured but with an edge he hadn't heard before. If you want to prove you can change, Nicholas, you'll have to show me. Not in diamonds. Not in dinners. In action. In humility. In becoming something more than the man who left us to starve while you built your kingdom. Nicholas leaned forward, heavy breath escaping like surrender. Then teach me. The admission shocked even him. Nicholas Harrington, who had once declared himself untouchable, now begged his wife to teach him how to be a better man. Evelyn watched closely, searching his expression for insincerity. But what she saw there was not arrogance this time, it was desperation. Perhaps even sincerity. Her answer was stern. Changing isn't for me, Nicholas. If you begin this path only for my approval, you'll fail. It has to be for you, for the man you choose to become. And with that, she rose and left him alone on the balcony, the plants swaying sadly in the night air. Nicholas sat until dawn, wrestling with thoughts he'd never dared let surface. His father's old words about power returned, win at all costs. But Evelyn's voice gnawed louder, change for yourself. The next morning marked the first step Nicholas never thought he'd take. Instead of riding directly to his glittering towers, he sent away the car. Instead of boardrooms, he found himself revisiting places he had once bulldozed on the way to his empire. Small buildings. Families destroyed. Faces forgotten. And on the very first doorstep, greeted by a man whose eyes carried the same weary rage Evelyn's had held, Nicholas stammered words he had never assembled before in his life. I'm here to apologize. It wasn't enough. Not yet. Not even close. But it was a beginning. And beginnings, Nicholas realized, were far harder to face than endings. Nicholas had built empires through signatures, sealed futures with handshakes in glass towers, and crushed rivals with a phone call. Yet nothing in his gilded history had prepared him for the act of knocking on a stranger's door with only apology as his offering. The first family was skeptical, angry even. Years ago, Nicholas's acquisition had erased their store, burying 2 generations of sweat under glossy contracts his lawyers drew like knives. When he introduced himself on their doorstep, the husband laughed bitterly. Harrington? Why don't you just add this house to your collection while you're here? Nicholas, accustomed to silencing rooms with his wealth, stood there stripped of excuses. I didn't come to take. I came to admit that what I did destroyed you. And I'm sorry. The words shocked even him. They felt foreign on his tongue, clumsy, inadequate. The family didn't invite him inside. But they didn't slam the door either. Nicholas would take that fragile opening as evidence that perhaps sincerity carried weight even wealth couldn't replace. When he returned to the penthouse that night, Evelyn was waiting in the living room, reading again, as if immune to the battles Nicholas had been fighting with himself all day. She studied him for a moment when he entered, tie loose, eyes haunted. You look less like an emperor tonight, she observed softly. Maybe that's the point, he muttered, collapsing into a chair. For weeks, Nicholas repeated the ritual. Doorsteps. Shops ruined by his hunger for expansion. Faces that once despised his name. He didn't attempt to buy forgiveness. Evelyn's warning echoed sharp in his ears. No hollow charity, no money packages disguised as band-aids for wounds he had created. Instead, he offered his presence. He listened, for the first time in his life he truly listened, to those who recalled how his greed had devastated them. Most met him with bitterness, some with rage, others with cautious indifference. But in every story, Nicholas carried away a splinter lodged in his chest, small fragments of the reckoning Evelyn demanded. His staff noticed the changes quickly. Nicholas no longer slammed through halls with the same arrogance. Meetings grew quieter, his temper less sharp. He began asking questions, real ones, surprising everyone who had only ever received orders. The newspapers speculated shifts in Harrington's strategy. Analysts wondered if the empire was faltering. But Nicholas knew it wasn't numbers he was wrestling with. It was himself. Evelyn, of course, remained measured. Some nights she ignored him completely, as though his efforts meant nothing. Other times she allowed a flicker of soft acknowledgement, a raised brow when he told her he had met with another family, a faint smile when she noticed he no longer barked at their household staff. She gave him no clear reward. And Nicholas realized with painful clarity how accustomed he had been to rewards. Conquest delivered applause, wealth delivered envy, charm delivered adoration. Now he walked in a desert with no applause at all, and the only water he sought was Evelyn's respect. One night, Nicholas entered the penthouse carrying not flowers, not jewels, but a simple paper bag of takeout from a modest diner. Evelyn looked at him quizzically when he placed it on the table. "I thought," he said almost awkwardly, "we could eat something real. Something that doesn't require 3 chefs and French labels." Evelyn studied him with suspicion, then curiosity. She sat across from him as they unwrapped simple sandwiches and fries. For the first time in weeks, Nicholas laughed unforced, grease on his fingers, cardboard containers littering the pristine marble. Evelyn allowed herself a small smile as well, faint but real. "Don't get used to my laughter," Nicholas teased unsuccessfully, though the warmth in his eyes betrayed sincerity. Evelyn tilted her head, watching him quietly. "Maybe that's who you should have been all along." And Nicholas for the first time admitted, "Maybe so." The redemption wasn't easy. Transformation never is. Each day Nicholas had to fight against the man he had spent years becoming, arrogant, ruthless, isolated. The old Nicholas wanted to reassert himself, to lean on habits of control and dominance. But Evelyn's silent trials kept him honest. She saw through every shallow gesture, stripped each false move bare. With her there was no mask. The more time they spent this way, the stranger Nicholas's world became. The man who once worshipped glass towers now lingered in bookstores with Evelyn, unbothered by ordinary shelves of paperbacks. The man who once flew to Paris for excitement now found peace in her balcony garden, digging fingers into earthy soil like he had never imagined. He began realizing that the things Evelyn valued, the small, the honest, the human, had always felt beneath him, but now somehow carried more weight than gold. Still, Evelyn wasn't ready to surrender. One evening as they sat at the kitchen island, Nicholas ventured carefully. "You see me trying. Doesn't that matter?" Evelyn leaned forward, her gaze sharp and cautious. "Effort is not the same as change, Nicholas. A wolf dressed in softer fur is still a wolf." Nicholas swallowed hard. "I'm not pretending anymore. I don't want to be the man I was." Her voice turned almost gentle, though her words were firm. "Then prove it. Not for me. Not for forgiveness. Prove it for yourself. Because until you want change that survives without my approval, you'll fall back into your empire of arrogance the second I turn away." And Nicholas, though it pained him, nodded. She was right. Change wasn't a costume he could wear until reward appeared. It was bones breaking and reforging. It was harder than war because it was inside him. The storm between them had shifted. From open hostility it now moved into something quieter, more dangerous. The pause before transformation. Evelyn's vindication simmered, Nicholas's desperate sincerity began to root itself, and the penthouse, once a glittering monument to ego, now felt like a crucible where a man was being reforged. Yet even in these moments, Evelyn carried something hidden. For though she was forcing Nicholas through transformation, there were truths she hadn't yet revealed, truths heavier than even her father's ruin. Nicholas Harrington might soon become a better man. But when the final secret surfaced, it would test not only his redemption, but whether love could ever truly rise from wreckage. The penthouse was quiet that night, unnervingly so. Nicholas had been away at a long investor dinner, one of the few he still attended personally, and returned to find Evelyn sitting in the balcony garden under the stars. She wasn't reading this time. She wasn't tending plants. She sat in stillness, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the sprawling lights of New York. Nicholas approached cautiously, his chest carrying a tangle of emotions: exhaustion, yearning, desperation for her approval. He brought her a cup of tea, setting it on the small table between them. "Here," he offered softly. She looked at the cup but didn't reach for it. Her eyes moved back to the skyline. "Do you ever wonder what's left when everything you build gets stripped away?" Nicholas sighed and sat opposite her. "Every day now." "Good," she whispered. They stayed in silence, listening to the distant hum of the city. Nicholas wrestled with words before finally saying, "You've changed me, Evelyn." Her gaze flickered to him, cool and assessing. "You've begun to change yourself. Don't give me credit for work you must finish." Nicholas's brow furrowed, hurt lacing his voice. "Why won't you meet me halfway? Can you not see how far I've come?" Her lips parted on a quiet exhale, the kind that carried years of buried pain. She turned toward him fully, the softness of moonlight highlighting her face but not whitening the lines carved by grief. When she spoke, her voice was heavier than he'd ever heard it. Because Nicholas, she said slowly, you still don't know the whole truth. Nicholas inhaled sharply, his chest closing with dread. He thought he knew what she meant, her father's ruin, the company crushed under his empire. But her eyes told him something deeper, darker. What truth? He asked carefully. Her hands tightened together in her lap. She stared at him, then spoke the words that shattered what little balance Nicholas had managed to recover. I was pregnant when your empire destroyed my father's company. The sentence struck Nicholas like a wrecking ball. His breath froze. His throat burned. He couldn't comprehend it. Evelyn kept her gaze unwavering. I was young, scared, yes, but hopeful. My father was struggling with his business, but I held on to the future. And then you came, with your mergers and your lawyers and your arrogance. In the chaos, in the grief when we lost everything. I lost the baby. Nicholas flinched physically as though struck across the face. Words refused to form in his mouth. He wanted to deny it, to insist it couldn't be his fault, but every instinct of self-defense died instantly. He saw it in her eyes, the truth of her pain. This was no theatrical trick, no ploy. This was Evelyn's hidden wound, the wound that had shaped her presence in his life, the wound that had brought her to his doorstep under the guise of matrimony. I didn't know, he croaked finally, his voice breaking. That's the problem, Nicholas, Evelyn said, tears finally streaking down her face, though her voice remained firm. You never knew. You never looked past your ledgers or your contracts. You didn't see lives collapsing underneath your climb. You didn't ask. And because of that, I lost the only thing I had left when my world fell apart. Nicholas staggered to his feet, pacing the balcony like a man drowning. His heart slammed against his chest in waves of guilt. It wasn't just her father's company anymore. It wasn't just bankruptcy and suicide. Now her story had bled into something personal, intimate, irreversible. A life ended before it began, shadowed forever under his empire's hunger. He tried again, but the weight in his chest made speaking impossible. Evelyn rose, standing just inches away, her eyes blazing with pain and iron strength. So you see now. You want to change. You want to redeem. But you will never wash this out of my memory. Nothing you do will bring back that child, or my father. You will carry this burden for the rest of your life. Nicholas's chest heaved. He wanted to fight for her forgiveness, to fall on his knees, but he saw in her face that forgiveness wasn't the point. Redemption was about who he could become, not for the sake of reward but for the sake of atoning with no guarantee of love in return. Tears brimmed in Nicholas's eyes, rare and raw. Evelyn, I would give up everything if it could take back your pain. Her lips trembled, but she shook her head. That's the tragedy, Nicholas. You can't. Silence stretched, long and unbearable. Nicholas sank into the chair, his strength evaporating, his empire meaningless. Evelyn stood tall, her shadow against the lights of Manhattan like judgment incarnate. But when she finally spoke again, her voice was softer. Yet, I can see you're different from the man who destroyed us. The question I still carry is whether you'll remain different after me. Whether you'll change because it's right, not because you want me to admire you. Nicholas lifted his head slowly, eyes red, voice cracking. Then let me prove it. Even if you never forgive me. Let me prove it until the day I die. Evelyn looked at him for a long, unbearable moment. Then she stepped back, her tears quiet but resolute. We'll see. With that she left him on the balcony, a billionaire gutted to his core. Nicholas sat alone long into the night, unable to bear the city's glow. He thought about an unborn life tied to his greed. He thought about Evelyn mourning in silence while he celebrated his rise. And he realized, perhaps for the first time, that no skyscraper he owned would ever be tall enough to outshine the shadow of what he had stolen. The man who had once believed himself indestructible now saw himself as the most fragile thing in the world. Fragmented, guilty, but desperate to be better. And Evelyn, though broken herself, held the key, not to his wealth, not to his empire, but to the man he could still choose to become. The morning after Evelyn's confession, sunlight spilled into the penthouse with almost mocking brightness. Nicholas hadn't slept. He had sat on the balcony until dawn, staring at the skyline as though it could judge him. His empire stretched across the horizon, the towers, the glass, the monuments to his ambition, and yet all he could see were graves. Her father's company, her shattered future, the unborn child she had lost because of his indifference. For the first time, Nicholas Harrington didn't want to step into his gleaming offices. He didn't want to hear stock updates, market analyses, or corporate strategies. He didn't want to shake hands with men who mirrored the same arrogance that had once defined him. Instead, he wanted to do something different, something that meant more than glance and quarterly reports. That morning, Nicholas called his assistant and canceled every meeting. The man's shock was palpable, but Nicholas didn't care. Instead, he drove himself, refusing drivers or security details, into the neighborhoods far below his empire's towers. He knocked on doors, stopping at shops that had crumbled in his rise, at community centers he had ignored while he clawed for profit margins. But more than doors, Nicholas opened his ears. He sat with small business owners over burnt coffee, listening for hours as they told him, face to face, how his acquisitions had drained their families. He showed up in schools, speaking openly with teachers who had once begged for funding only to watch Harrington Holdings funnel millions into another luxury tower. He listened, not with cold detachment, not with dismissive ears, but with the humility of a man who finally understood that wealth had weight, and he had been crushing people with it for years. At first, people didn't believe him. Some cursed him, threw him out, spit bitter words he knew he deserved. He did not fight back. He did not lecture. He absorbed every insult until his chest throbbed with the weight of it. For the first time in his life, Nicholas recognized that dignity didn't come from diamonds. It came from facing the anger of people wronged and standing there without defense. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. A mother at a community center, her face drawn but her voice steady, said, "At least you're here. At least you're listening." The word struck Nicholas harder than any insult. Listening was the smallest thing, yet to her, it was everything. When he returned home that night, Evelyn was again in the balcony garden. She glanced up when he entered, eyes narrowing at his disheveled appearance, shirt slightly wrinkled, dark circles dragging under his eyes. "You're late," she said coolly. "I wasn't at the office," Nicholas replied quietly. She raised her brows, unconvinced. "Then where?" "I listened today. To people you'd say I've crushed. I listened, Evelyn. Not as Harrington the billionaire. Just as Nicholas." Her expression didn't change much, but something flickered in her eyes, tiny, fleeting admiration. "Words," she said softly. "Still, that's all I hear." Nicholas nodded. "Then I'll keep listening until they become more than words." In the weeks that followed, Nicholas lived a life unrecognizable from his old one. He spent less time in penthouses and private jets and more time walking streets unguarded, shaking hands unloved by power. He began funding, not with grand gestures designed for publicity, but with quiet reparation projects, rebuilding a bakery that had been shuttered, helping a struggling bookstore survive, creating scholarships and names forgotten behind spreadsheets. But he kept everything private. No journalists, no press releases, no glossy photographs. The old Nicholas would never have done it in secrecy. He would have needed the applause, the magazine covers, the bragging rights. Now, silence became proof to himself that the change was genuine. Every night, when he returned to Evelyn, he said little. And every night, she studied him carefully, searching for the cracks, the performance, the hidden strategy. She found something else: exhaustion, humility, sincerity. For the first time, Nicholas Harrington began looking like a man instead of an empire. Still, Evelyn withheld. She wasn't ready to yield her heart to him, not after so much pain. But slowly the edges of her armor softened. She began to join him occasionally, once at a community kitchen, where she watched him roll up his sleeves and serve soup alongside strangers. Watching Nicholas, the untouchable billionaire, rinse dishes in that kitchen made something stir in her chest that she hadn't allowed in years. She didn't tell him. She wouldn't. Not yet. One night, the turning point came unexpectedly. It was late, the city curled in sleep while the penthouse glowed in muted light. Nicholas was writing, actual letters, hand-penned apologies to families from his past dealings. Evelyn walked in, surprised to see him hunched over the table with ink-stained hands. She picked up one of the envelopes and read the first lines. "To the family of..." Her breath caught. It was her father's name. Nicholas lifted his eyes, weary but determined. "I can't bring him back. I can't erase the pain. But I can honor him. I can build something in his name that matters. Maybe it's selfish, maybe I'm trying to make myself feel less monstrous. But it's all I can do. And I'll do it, with or without your forgiveness. Tears prickled at Evelyn's eyes, though she blinked them back. Her father's name hadn't been written by Nicholas's hand since the day his company was destroyed. Seeing it now, etched in sincerity rather than conquest, pulled at her in ways anger couldn't silence. For the first time since their marriage began, Evelyn laid her hand over Nicholas's. If you do this, Nicholas, if you truly walk this path, it won't bring him back. It won't bring my child back. But maybe, just maybe, it will bring me reason to believe your change is more than desperation. Nicholas held her gaze, his voice breaking. Then I'll keep walking, Evelyn. As far as it takes. And in that moment, the billionaire finally understood. Redemption was not a finish line. It was a road without end, one he would have to travel every day for the rest of his life. For Evelyn, it was the first real crack in her resolve, a flicker of the possibility that Nicholas Harrington might not just be broken, but reborn. The air in the Harrington penthouse was different now. It wasn't softer, not entirely, but it carried a current of something raw and unfamiliar, vulnerability. Nicholas walked through his own space no longer as a king surveying territory, but as a man humbled by the shadows of choices that had defined his empire. And Evelyn, though still guarded, had begun to see glimpses of something even she hadn't expected. Glimpses of a man she could have never imagined when she first accepted the marriage. It wasn't swift, not like movies or novels. Redemption, she realized, was not glamorous. It was Nicholas staying up late to write another painful letter, one in which he admitted his greed had left more scars than he could ever count. It was him showing up at schools to apologize for endowments he had refused, sitting cross-legged in worn classrooms where children offered him no deference. It was him turning down acquisitions that reeked of exploitation, even when the board threatened revolt. Little by little, she watched the titan shrink into something mortal, and in its own peculiar way, something larger than he had ever seen before. One evening, as winter snow dusted the city, Nicholas prepared dinner himself. The kitchen looked like a battle zone, pots cluttered, ingredients spread chaotically, but he insisted. Evelyn walked in, astonished by the sight of a man who once believed kitchens were merely rooms for staff. "You cooked?" she asked, suspicion in her tone. "I tried," he admitted, sheepish, handing her a misshapen plate of pasta. "It's burnt around the edges. Don't ask how." Evelyn laughed, an unguarded, genuine sound that startled them both. Nicholas froze, watching her shoulders shake, the hard lines of her face soften with humor. That laugh, the sound of it, felt to him like a sunrise breaking after years of storm. It was, perhaps, the first night they shared not as combatants but as something else. Two people fumbling toward intimacy. Still, walls remained. Evelyn wasn't ready to let go of all the pain. Some nights she looked at Nicholas and still saw the man who ruined her father. Some days she felt guilty that her heart dared to move toward him at all. Forgiveness wasn't a switch she could flip. But her resolve was softening, slowly, warily, almost unwillingly. Then came the night that changed everything. Nicholas surprised her with a visit not to another restaurant, but to a small brick community center on the edge of the city. Snow clung to the doorways as he led Evelyn inside. She frowned, confused, until she saw the plaque being mounted on the wall by workers. Her breath froze when she read the inscription. The Carter Foundation for Renewal. Beneath it, in elegant but restrained letters, dedicated to Daniel Carter, whose integrity and resilience inspired a new generation. Evelyn's hands flew to her mouth. Tears welled instantly. She turned sharply toward Nicholas, eyes wide with disbelief. "You," she whispered, voice cracking. Nicholas nodded, his throat tight. "It's not charity. It's not about my name. It's your father's. His work, his values. Everything I tried to erase. I want to help restore it. Not for you to forgive me. Not to be seen in the papers. Just because it's what should exist in the world." Evelyn stared at the plaque, tears spilling freely now. For years she had dreamed of her father's name restored, not buried under bankruptcy filings and whispers of failure. To see it here, etched permanently into stone, clawed something open inside her that hurt and healed at the same time. For the first time since their marriage began, Evelyn stepped into Nicholas's arms willingly. She buried her face in his chest, the sobs shaking her shoulders, and Nicholas held her like a man clinging to absolution. He pressed his forehead to hers, whispering, trembling himself. "I can't erase the past. But I will spend whatever days I have left making the future different. Not because I seek your forgiveness, though I pray for it, but because I want to become someone both your father and our child would have been proud of." Evelyn's tears burned hot. She pulled back slightly, her hands cupping his face. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, Nicholas. But tonight, I believe you. I believe you mean it. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't full absolution. But to Nicholas it was salvation." Months passed and small signs of warmth began to emerge. Evelyn started laughing more, not with theatricality but with unguarded ease. Nicholas surprised her with flowers not of obscene rarity but simple peonies, her favorite. They ate together not as silent adversaries but as companions. In the quiet spaces of their home, where shadows had once suffocated, light began to grow. Eventually, Evelyn's heart opened the way spring breaks stubbornly from winter. One morning as Nicholas poured her tea, strong, no sugar, she reached across the table, placed her hand on his and whispered, "I don't just see change anymore. I see the man you're becoming. And I think I might be ready to love him." Nicholas's chest shook with relief. He didn't break into triumphant smiles or declarations. He simply bowed his head, whispering a thank you not just to her but perhaps to fate itself. Theirs had never been a conventional love story. It had been born of arrogance, forged in revenge, scarred by pain. But it became something else, something neither of them could have scripted. A story of ruin remade into redemption. She married the billionaire. And in doing so she broke him wide open, forcing him to face truths no market collapse ever could. What no one expected was that from within the wreckage of greed and hatred, something fragile but unshakable might grow, something resembling love. For Evelyn Carter and Nicholas Harrington, the bet they had both entered from different sides ended not with winners and losers, but with two people scarred, transformed, and somehow, against all odds, redeemed. And in the end, that was the story no one expected.